The report from the Working Group 1 of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was released today. So I'm going to be talking to Dr. Denis Gilbert from the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans about that. He was part of Canada's IPCC delegation. So welcome to the interview, Denis.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Markham. It's so much fun talking to you.
Now, when we were chatting before the interview started, you said that this report was about the physical science of climate change. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that it's not going to go into detail about the impacts on, say, fish growth in the Pacific Ocean or on forestry in northern Saskatchewan or things like that. It's really more concerned because that's going to be part of Working Group 2, which deals with the impacts of climate change. Whereas Group 1 is really about the physical climate system, going all the way from the sun's rays impacting the earth to the greenhouse gases trapping more of the infrared heat from the ground surface, preventing it from escaping to space, to ocean currents, to formation of sea ice, to melting of the ice sheets and mountain glaciers, and also all kinds of exchanges between the land surface and the atmosphere. So it's really about the physical processes of climate.
So I was reading the executive summary, and it said that the climate science had improved quite a bit of late, and that the science is incontrovertible anymore. It can't be disputed that the Earth is warming.
Well, in fact, you know, there's one word that's called unequivocal. And unequivocal was introduced back in 2007 for one thing. It was just to say that back in 2007, during the fourth assessment, it was unequivocal that the climate was warming. What's new in this one, we're 14 years later, in 2021, is that the word unequivocal is used to say that the warming that was unequivocally observed in 2007 is so now unequivocal that this is due primarily to human influences. So the word unequivocal has even been tagged onto attributing the warming to human activities.
Oh, well, very interesting. Well, one of the things that I've asked you in previous interviews is how do we know that the science is accurate? And maybe I'll ask you of this, if you can answer it. How do we know that this science is unequivocal and that the conclusions are beyond refute?
Yeah, well, you know, there's one of the figures in the summary for policymakers that actually shows how various factors can try and mimic the observed temperature record over the 20th century all the way to 2020. And essentially, when you only put natural causes and, you know, changes in solar radiation and things like that, you end up with a flat line in terms of the temperature of the Earth. It remains essentially stable, whereas the observations show that it's been going up. And the only way to reproduce the observations with models is if you increase the concentrations of greenhouse gases. And one thing that's also interesting in that particular figure that I'm referring to, and whose number I can't recall, is they've also quantified the partially counteracting effect of aerosols, because, you know, when we burn fossil fuels, we not only emit CO2 in the atmosphere or release methane, we also, in our combustion activities, release soot and a bunch of things that will also affect climate in a different direction. Like if you emit a lot of aerosols, it will reflect more of the sunlight back out to space, and there's a cooling effect associated with that. And it's only when you take into account the cooling effects of the aerosols, which is like really a cooling effect, and the warming effect of the greenhouse gases, when you combine all of that, you reproduce the observations, but just using natural background pre-industrial concentrations of CO2 is not going to help you reproduce the observed temperatures.
So what comes next, Denis? I understand there's a working group 2 and a working group 3 that'll be reporting in 2022. What will they be reporting about?
Yeah, well, working group 2 on impacts looks at essentially like the biosphere. I'm thinking here of there's going to be things about migration of species northward when you're in the northern hemisphere, but southward if you're in the southern hemisphere. So I should have better said migration poleward of some species. There's going to be things about coastal erosion, because whereas working group 1 talks more about sea level rise, impacts of sea level rise include things like coastal erosion and displacement of coastal populations from where they live. There's going to be things about forestry, like will particular species of trees be replaced by other species that originally were closer to the equator. So these kinds of things are going to be in the impacts work of working group 2.
Now, Denis, you were telling me that the federal government gave you a particular mandate for the delegation when, in this case, what was that mandate?
The mandate was really to make sure that the science was accurate. So if we found like inconsistencies between what was in the main chapters of the report versus the summary for policymakers, if we were able to find inconsistencies, then raise them in the discussions with the authors, and then have them make those corrections if necessary. When authors acknowledge that there is indeed an inconsistency, it sometimes leads to what they call tricklebacks. There will need to be some corrections that percolate from the summary for policymakers to the chapters. This is something we see in the chapters that people can download today. They will see that at the beginning of chapters, there's a list of tricklebacks that they will now have to make to correct before, and do some final copy editing before the final chapters are eventually released. But people, as of today, can download the chapters as they are. It's just that a few months from now, there's going to be definitive versions with all of the corrections done.
Right. My understanding is that the government was very keen that you go and support the science, whatever the science said.
Absolutely. Our mandate is to make sure that the science is depicted accurately, and in case there might be some attempt from people at that meeting to try and dilute some of the scientific findings, we'd help be on the side of the authors and help them make sure that the science is not diluted. But I should say that regardless of that, one thing that's really remarkable about the IPCC is that the only ones who have the fingers on and capable of typing and changing words are the authors themselves. In other words, if the authors do not agree to a wording that is not in line with the science, it'll not go into the summary for policymakers. So there's some negotiations involved, but there's a veto right on the part of the scientific authors. They unless they agree to the changes in wording, it's not happening. So they have final word. The scientists have final word, and we're just supporting them in their work.
Final question, Denis. So it's fair to say, and this has come up in other interviews that I've done with you, fair to say that the science is accurate and credible and high confidence in that science.
Yeah, well, there's things where we have remarkable confidence and accuracy, but again, there's other things where we know a lot less. So let's say the things about like upper ocean surface, upper ocean warming. we know a lot, and the temperature of the atmosphere, we know a lot. It's very solid science. But there's other parts of the climate system that are much more uncertain. One of those has got to do with the melting of the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. This is one where it's acknowledged within the report. It's an area that they call low, like if you think of a collapse, a rapid collapse of those ice sheets where they would melt much more rapidly. They call it a low likelihood, but very high impact event. And they describe why it is that it's hard to model and what they don't know about it, but they still want to raise a flag and that this might happen, because even though the science is not yet mature on those topics, the impacts of a rapid melting of those ice sheets for coastal communities would be very large. For example, they come up, yeah.
So just to clarify, in areas where the science is not as mature, so you might have a low confidence or a medium confidence in it, but that doesn't invalidate the larger conclusions, because you have enough of the science where you do have a very high confidence level in.
Yeah, well, that's one thing that the report does very well. For every single statement, there's a confidence level associated with it. So for some statements, it's going to be high confidence. Some cases, very high confidence. In other cases, it's going to be low confidence. So, for example, the low likelihood event of the melting of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheet, they have low confidence in those predictions, but the impacts are so large that they felt they needed to talk about it, because we're talking about the possibility, if things go bad with those ice sheets, of 2 meter sea level rise by 2100 and perhaps 5 meter by 2150. So these are very big numbers, and the decision makers need to know about those possibilities.
Denis, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Really appreciate your insights.
Well, you're most welcome, Markham. Thank you very much.